In British culture, there is one thing that unites us all in the face of division and we can universally agree upon. Pubs are class. However, one pub chain has woven itself into the fabric of British identity. Whether it's 4 AM pints at Stansted Airport paired with a £2 English breakfast, or students guzzling down pictures of sex on the beach, Wetherspoons has become a staple of generations' food and alcohol consumption. With at its peak, over 1,000 public houses across the UK and a cool £2 billion in revenue. And it's easy to understand why. It's cheap, there's one in every town and city, and everyone's welcome. So how did one man take the bedrock of third spaces in the UK and turn it into a national chain and basically own every pub in Britain? The founder of Spoons, Timothy Randall Martin, was born in Norwich, England in 1955, but spent much of his early life in Northern Ireland and abroad due to his father's job as a Guinness executive. Tim also attended boarding school in New Zealand and later studied law at the University of Nottingham, although he never pursued a legal career. Instead, Martin became interested in the hospitality industry, particularly the pub scene, which he saw ripe for innovation and modernisation. In December 1975, at the age of 24, Martin bought his first pub. It was a converted betting shop in Muswell Hill, North London. Initially called Martin's Free House, it was soon renamed Wetherspoons. This change in names was actually changed to match the last name of a teacher who once told Tim that he would never amount to anything. And whatever you think of Tim, you've got to respect him for that. But saying that, in order to keep this YouTube dream alive, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel, because I'm getting these videos out basically weekly now. Well, just about. But if YouTube wasn't enough, my videos are also now available on Spotify, so if you can't get enough of me, you can now listen and watch all of my videos on the go. So make sure to check that out. Anyway, back to the video. From the outset, Tim's approach was different. He wanted to offer a comfortable, affordable, and inclusive environment, free from blaring music and fruit machines that characterised many of the pubs at the time. Essentially, Martin wanted to create Orwell's version of the perfect pub: clean, welcoming, and focused on value.
It was 1986, and we've been going for 7 years, and we'd opened the 6th or 7th pub. No one knew us, no one had written about us, but a chap from the Daily Telegraph lived in the area, and he said, actually, this pub has got no music, does food all day, very nice decor, it's very like Orwell's fictional perfect pub. And so the next pub we opened we called the Moon Underwater, which was the Orwell name.
Throughout the early 1980s, Wetherspoons gradually expanded, with all pubs initially located in North London. These early pubs included longer opening hours, a simplified and affordable menu, and a focus on real beer. Prior to the 1990s, most pubs were owned by breweries, with some being directly managed by breweries themselves, and others being let out to landlords.
If you took North London, for example, it was dominated by 4 or 5 big brewers, and there were very few individually owned pubs, so the beer selection was quite narrow. It tended to be the pubs that brewer brewed, so you couldn't get Abbott, you couldn't get Ruddles County in London, you couldn't get Young's Special Bitter, a South London beer, in North London, so it was a more restricted choice.
By 1990, JD Wetherspoons owned over 40 establishments, leading them to innovate and expand more aggressively. So much so, by 1992, Spoons was listed on the London Stock Exchange as JDW, which would allow the company to raise capital and create a strong financial foundation to expand even further. Things like hosting real ale events and opening its first non-smoking bar, well ahead of the nation's smoking ban, made it a popular option on the high street. It was also at this time that the company began to experiment with new formats, opening its first pubs in train stations and in airports. By the end of the decade, Wetherspoons was rapidly expanding beyond London and acquiring larger sites, often repurposing former cinemas, banks, and other historic buildings, a strategy that essentially killed 2 birds with 1 stone, keeping both the cost down and giving each pub a unique character.
When we were expanding the pubs still mostly in big cities belonged to brewers, and they didn't want to sell their best pubs. So we found that for buildings like this, often dilapidated, we could get planning permission to restore them, which was very expensive, and we could get a pub license.
By the 2000s, Spoons had become a fixture on the British high street and in town centres nationwide, opening hundreds of pubs and even diversifying into hotels, which would continue the relentless focus on value. As of 2025, Spoons has nearly 800 pubs, employs thousands of staff, and has an annual revenue of more than £2 billion. But what makes Spoons so successful is their ability ability to weather economic downturns and adapt to changing consumer habits, like the rise of breakfast and coffee sales, which now serves millions of coffees every year, making it a major competitor to established coffee chains like Costa and Starbucks. So how the fuck are Spoons able to offer such lower prices compared to everyone else? Well, basically, the perk to operating a vast network of pubs allows them to achieve economies of scale in purchasing, logistics, and operations, allowing Spoons to offer food and drink prices significantly lower than most places. Spoons is also one of the largest purchasers of beer in the UK, allowing them to have long-dated supply deals that stabilise what beers are on tap and how they're priced. The sheer size of the company allows it to negotiate harder on everything from bacon to those blue pattern plates. Not only that, it also helps that the menu is simplified, with repeatable processes that can be trained easily, essentially meaning that if you know how to work a grill, microwave, or a deep fryer, you're pretty much set. In fact, in 2020, a Wetherspoon staff member was allegedly suspended for making a TikTok about how the food was made, leaving many surprised that many of the items on the menu, like the chicken curry, only required a microwave to cook. But if you're genuinely surprised by that, I don't know what to tell you. The food is literally under £5. As well as the simplified menu, the pubs are usually quite big spaces, meaning the labour per guest can be more efficient, especially when getting orders through the Wetherspoons app, reducing bar bottlenecks and allowing staff to be more flexible. In fact, I would personally argue that the app is kind of what makes Spoons Spoons. The ability to get anything ordered to your table at the click of a button is incredible, not only because it saves you going up to order, but you can also play a game that has become embedded in the UK meme culture, where you basically put your table number and location on your Instagram story and get followers or friends to buy more and more ridiculous items until the Wetherspoon staff become increasingly more pissed off and cut you off after the 12th order of 4 Jaeger bombs and a bowl of peas. Spoon staff really don't like that, so maybe don't do it, but it is quite funny. But the social media world has never really been a necessary part of Spoon's marketing or business plan. In fact, on the 16th of April 2018, Wetherspoons decided to ditch their social media channels, with Tim stating, "We are going against the conventional wisdom that these platforms are a vital component of a successful business. We were also concerned that the pub managers were being sidetracked from their real job of serving customers. I don't believe that closing these accounts will affect our business whatsoever." But because Spoons doesn't have social media, they doubled down on in-house advertising like posters and their in-house magazine that they publish. It's in these magazines where it communicates its views around tax and regulation in the hospitality industry. This includes one of the most persistent campaigns that Spoons deploy, which is a tax equality day, one day a year where there's a 7.5% price cut across all their pubs to dramatise what a lower VAT rate for hospitality would look like. The company argues that pubs and restaurants pay 20% VAT on food and full business rates, while supermarkets pay zero VAT on food, letting supermarkets subsidise alcohol prices and undermine on-trade venues. So Spoon kind of uses the day to press chancellors for reform. You see, Tim isn't exactly shy from sharing his political views and using Wetherspoons as a vehicle to campaign for legislation. This has led to many controversies through his business decisions, most notably on Brexit. Tim was one of the most high-profile business leaders to support Brexit, using Spoon's pubs to campaign for the UK to leave the European Union. Tim began being outspoken about the EU in 2013, when he claimed that the EU was undemocratic and bureaucratic, and that UK businesses are burdened by over-regulations from Brussels. As the referendum loomed, Tim ramped up his campaigning, giving multiple interviews warning that Britain's sovereignty is being eroded. And just months before, Tim spent nearly 95 grand on 200,000 pro-Brexit beer mats, posters and booklets that were distributed across his pubs. He even embarked on a nationwide pub tour that would gain a large amount of media attention, where he argued that Brexit would lower prices by allowing free trade with non-EU countries.
If we leave the customs union on the 31st of October, Wetherspoon will bring price of beer down to an unbelievable low.
So that's a guarantee then, is it, that we're going to
That's
have
a
cheaper
guarantee.
pints?
You heard it first here, but we have to leave properly, Boris Johnson, on the 31st of October. No messing around with customs unions or any of that funny stuff.
It's going to be a catastrophe, a disaster, and all this type of language. I don't think it's true at all. You want to do a deal with the EU, which is as much to the EU's advantage as ours, and you've got to pay a fortune. So I think we're better off on the 29th of March, in a few weeks, leaving with no deal.
But this political activism drew both praise and criticism, with some investors and staff questioning whether it was appropriate for the company to take such a bold stance. Critics argued that Martin was kind of exploiting his position by forcing staff to distribute political material despite his staff or customers not necessarily having the same stance as him. As we all know, on the 23rd of June 2016, the UK decided to leave the EU, but it wasn't an overnight severing of our European arm, but more of a brutal and long process with a blunt penknife. But post-Brexit, Tim continued to campaign fiercely as trade deals were being discussed. In 2017, he published pamphlets titled "Time to Take Back Control" in pubs and even removed several EU-sourced drinks from menus, most notably replacing champagne and Prosecco with UK sparkling wines and German and French beers with Australian and US brands. Tim stated, "There will be an inevitable transfer of trade post-Brexit to countries outside the EU, which will reduce prices in shops and pubs. However, we are starting to make the transition to non-EU trade now." In 2018, Wetherspoons ordered another 500,000 pro-Brexit beer mats that got distributed across pubs, with Tim arguing that the UK should adopt a unilateral free trade, basically meaning no import tariffs on goods from anywhere. Martin said, "The public, the press and the MPs have been lied to by Tyler, the CBI and other organisations that food prices will inevitably rise if we leave the EU without a deal. It's important to provide the public with the truth, so they're able to decide for themselves." By 2019, Leave Me and Leave rallies were taking place across the country, with Tim sharing the stage with Nigel Farage to speak about Brexit. He also ordered another round of beer mats, urging customers to reject a soft Brexit or delay calling for a clean break. This once again resulted in backlash from shareholders and some employees for politicising pubs. In December of the same year, the general election took place, where Tim very much endorsed Boris Johnson for Prime Minister. "I think he can be a good Prime Minister because he has had another job. He's been a magazine editor for a long time, which is a tough gig. He's been Mayor of London and he was very successful in leading the referendum campaign, so I think he's a winner. Can he deliver Brexit? I hope that he can." Because of the Conservatives' election victory, it saw the pound boosted and sent shares in a number of UK companies absolutely flying, basically in the hopes that all of the concerns around Brexit would now fade away. Wetherspoons was one of these companies that saw a dramatic increase, with the value of Tim's stake in the pub jumping almost 10%, from 487 million to 531 million. Now, in March 2020, the virus from an unknown origin hit the UK, leaving pubs up and down the country in a precarious place. The government ordered all pubs and hospitality venues to close. However, Tim argued against Boris's lockdown, asking for evidence from scientists that pubs would spread COVID. But even before COVID, Wetherspoons faced repeated controversy over his treatment of staff, being accused of not paying the real living wage and resisting trade union recognition. Basically, a real living wage is set by the Living Wage Foundation, which sets the rate based on the actual cost of living, which is apparently £12.60 per hour and a higher rate of £13.85 for London. However, Spoons apparently pays an hourly rate of £12.31 to £13.70, but Spoons also highlights the benefits like paid training time, a complimentary meal during each shift, and an employee discount. A few days later, Tim sent a video to its 40,000 staff, saying that they should feel free to take up jobs in supermarkets while Spoons remains closed.
Hi everyone, I'm very sorry about the situation that's occurred with our pubs. They've been shut, as you know, unprecedented in the last 40 years, and it puts everyone in a terribly difficult position. And I know you're all sitting there wondering what the hell's happening, and over the weekend I've had lots of phone calls with different people, and we're trying to sort it all out as best we can in this highly unusual situation. The good news is that the government has undertaken to underwrite people's wages for an indefinite amount of time. So that's great, because we've got no money coming in through the tills, which is not something that we'd ever planned for, as you can appreciate. The government's promised to pay about 80% of wages. They'll probably be pretty slow about paying it, so there may be some delays, for which I also apologise, but I feel sure they're going to come through on their promise. Our main aim, and my main aim, is to reopen. We employ over 40,000 people. It's very important for them. Just as important perhaps for the country is Wetherspoon, thanks to you, pays 1/1000th of all taxes. So it's very important to the country that we reopen. It might be weeks, it might be months. Tremendous pressure on us all because of the uncertainty, apart from all the practical considerations. all our endeavours are going to be on trying to make sure that you get your money and that pubs reopen. I know that almost all our trade now has gone to supermarkets, not only our trade, but the trade from cafes, leisure centres, restaurants, etc. So we've had lots of calls from supermarkets. Tesco alone want 20,000 people to join them. That's half the number of people who work in our pubs. If I'm being honest, I say you can get the furlough payments and stay at home. If you're offered a job at a supermarket, many of you will want to do that. If you think it's a good idea, do it. I can completely understand it. If you've worked for us before, I promise you we'll give you first preference if you want to come back, and we'll all obviously completely understand that you don't want to wait around for us to reopen. But deeply appreciate your work. I've just so much enjoyed talking to you in my pub calls over the weeks, and best of luck.
This video didn't exactly go down well, and caused Tim to clarify a few days later that he wasn't sacking anyone, but the pay would stop until the government's furlough scheme was operational. This decision led to protests, negative media coverage, and backlash from both the public and politicians. Rachel Reeves, who at the time was the chair of the Business Select Committee, stated, "Unacceptable that Wetherspoons has refused to pay its 40,000 employees until it receives its government loan, potentially in late April. After first refusing to lock down altogether, if bosses disregard employees' well-being, then government should take tougher action to force compliance." By April, Tim was in full damage control and announced that Spoon staff would receive furlough pay, and also wrote an open letter thanking NHS workers and apologised for the confusion. The incident damaged its reputation and highlighted the broader issues around lower pay and the precarious work environment in the hospitality sector. On the 23rd of June, the UK government announced that pubs could reopen from the 4th of July, with Tim calling it a victory for common sense. And so, on America's Independence Day, Wetherspoons reopened 750 of its pubs with multiple safety measures such as plexiglass screens and social distancing. This reopening would coincide with the government's plan to get the economy going, called Eat Out to Help Out, which basically told people to go out to restaurants and pubs and spend your money. This was actually a brilliant idea by the government, because not only did it not really improve the economy, it spread COVID even quicker, meaning that regional lockdowns and closure of pubs were enforced once again in November. As a result of the turbulent COVID year, Wetherspoons recorded its first major annual loss in 36 years, with a $105 million pre-tax loss and sales down over 30%. By April 2021, Wetherspoons were allowed to reopen 400 pubs with beer gardens, which was then followed by a full indoor reopening of all 860 of its pubs the following month. Ironically, in summer 2021, the UK had a shortage of HGV drivers, which disrupted supply chains and ultimately made Spoons run short of certain beer brands, which then led people to point out that a high-profile Brexit campaigner was now caught in the logistical turbulence of their own doing. In 2022, as restrictions to COVID ended, Spoon saw sales beginning to recover and even return to profitability by the end of the year. However, Tim still believed that the government's handling of COVID was poor and that the hospitality industry was scapegoated. But beyond Brexit, staff pay and COVID, Wetherspoon's other major controversy is its impact on local communities and the traditional pub industry. The argument is that Spoon's low prices and aggressive expansion have contributed to the decline of independent pubs and the overall pub experience. While Spoons can be credited for revitalising high streets and making pub going accessible to a wider audience, especially in the cost of living crisis, it has also threatened the independent pub. I mean, other than atmosphere, why would you go to an independent pub and pay £7 a pint when you could go to Spoons and get the same beer for half the price? With Spoon's scale, purchasing power, and ability to operate on razor-thin margins, it makes it literally impossible to compete. But it's not just the economics behind Spoons, but also the cultural aspect that independent pubs bring. Chains like Wetherspoons and Green King don't exactly hold the same vibe as a quirky pub that sells local ales. Having said that, I think that many would argue that Spoons is culture. Sure, it's commercialised culture, but the historic buildings, patterned carpets, and the 8-mile trek to the bathroom in itself is kind of comforting every time you visit. But having said all of that, the decline of independent pubs can't be solely blamed on Wetherspoons. There are so many factors, like the cost of living, rising rents, changing drinking habits, and increased regulation from the government, that have caused thousands of pubs to close over the past 2 decades. As of 2025, there are apparently only 16,409 independent pubs in the UK, and more than 25,000 that are leased or managed, branded or franchised. In 2015, just a decade ago, there were an extra 5,000 independent pubs in the country, which is kind of insane to think about. But because Wetherspoons almost holds a monopoly of pubs, it's often blamed for the contributing decline of the pub culture. In fact, some people have taken action against spoons by even creating an app called Neverspoons that shows you where every independent pub is, hoping to encourage people to support local businesses. But with all of this in mind, it's hard to argue that Tim hasn't contributed a lot to the UK. In fact, on the 29th of December 2023, he was given a knighthood for his services to hospitality and culture. To this day, Tim visits several of the pubs every week, and even introduced a queue law to some of their pubs. Basically, they try to make queuing at the bar more orderly in some locations, by ordering barriers and a formal line. But after a massive backlash from drinkers, who consider standing aimlessly at the bar and passive-aggressively glaring at the bartenders a national tradition, the system was ultimately ditched. In an interview in 2024, Martin gave a hint at what might happen to his empire after his death. Despite having 4 children and 10 grandchildren, he said that his successor won't be drawn from his family, stating, "I never fancied a dynasty." When asked who he would appoint, he said, "Someone who listens and wouldn't change everything. Small improvements over time. Wetherspoons didn't serve cappuccinos when it started." Love him or hate him, Tim Martin has done something pretty extraordinary. He's taken the most sacred British institution, the pub, and industrialised it without completely killing the soul. Sure, the carpets are hideous, the food is questionably beige, and the clientele is a social experiment after 10 PM, but it works. It's affordable, familiar, and somehow still feels ours. Thank you so much for watching this video, it really does mean a lot to me. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel for weekly videos, follow me on Instagram at Phat, like, subscribe, and comment below what you want to see next.